Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as we see today how Americans realized in the 1840s that it was our destiny to fill up and expand the frontier. Now, American history has always been based on expansion, from the earliest days of settlers from Jamestown pushing out into the swamps around them in search of gold and land to plant tobacco. And furthermore, this expansion has taken place in recent historical memory. An idea expressed most famously by one of the most influential American historians, Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, he put forth his famous Frontier Thesis in a speech and article, later expanded into an entire book, known as The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Again, the Frontier Thesis, or Turner Thesis for short. And according to Turner, having a frontier is what made America different from other countries, different and special. He said the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development in making us different and special. An idea sometimes described as American exceptionalism. According to Turner, in America, the frontier was where democracy was created and where it was born anew every time the frontier advanced. As the edge of settlement moved westward, people moved away from the traditions and centers of power in the east. Furthermore, without the conveniences of the settled world, they had to work side by side and discover equality, at least a greater sense of equality than had been known in the societies they left behind them. Jamestown and New England may not seem especially democratic by today's standards, but they were more democratic than England. Tennessee in our early days, allowing any free man who owned any amount of property to vote, it may not be as democratic as we hope for today, but still opened up voting to more people than most other states in the 1790s. As people expanded west again, democracy would become greater. These newly democratized men who created more democratic state governments were in turn elected to public office, to Congress, to the Senate, eventually, with Andrew Jackson, to the presidency. They returned to the old seats of power to renew and reinvigorate American politics with democratic ideals all over again. Furthermore, the frontier could serve as a safety valve, as a way for people in the East who did not fit in, perhaps into overcrowded cities, or who simply were not prepared to fit into established society, to head west, a place to absorb the surplus population, which helped to keep wages relatively high in the East. The fact that people could move west, even if it was much more easily said than done, did force American factory owners, at least in the mid-1800s, to pay higher wages than was the case in similar European factories. This also kept American cities from exploding in riots and revolution, as sometimes happened in Europe. But over time, the Frontier Thesis, which was very influential from the 1890s well into the 20th century, came to have some critics, in part simply because a new generation of professional historians wanted to make names for themselves by tearing down the currently popular theory, hoping to replace it with their own, but also because there really were some problems with the Frontier Thesis. It is predicated, of course, on, as Turner put it, the existence of an area of free land. But was that land entirely free? Was it totally empty? There were those eventually who became sympathetic to the misfortunes of the American Indians, from whose point of view the land was definitely not empty. Furthermore, the notion that settling a frontier made America different, indeed unique, had some problems. Likewise, the fact that it created democracy had some issues too, in terms of being unique. The fact is that Canada, Australia, both had very similar colonial histories, settling a number of separate colonies which eventually united into a single colony, with, in fact, an artificial capital created more or less at the midpoint of the major settled areas at the time, and places, too, that pushed aside their native peoples, what Canadians now call the First Nations or the Aborigines of Australia. And these two did create democracies. So it does support Turner's notion about the frontier creating democracy, but not necessarily that America is unique. Although at the time Turner was writing, Australia had not completed this process, and even Canada, although united and having recently built their own transcontinental railroad, was still officially ruled by Britain. Other places are a bit more problematic. South Africa also settled its frontier in a similar way, also pushed aside native peoples. Although the term native was used so long by people who were so harsh to the natives that it's considered a very offensive word there, similar to a different word in America also starting with an N. And there, the native peoples were pushed aside, but not totally wiped out. And while South Africa definitely created a vibrant democracy for white people, the vote was denied to the black majority. Brazil, too, settled a frontier, pushing aside a native population, and created eventually a republic, but one that's also had periods of military dictatorship. So there we see two more cases of frontiers expanding and being settled in historical memory, but creating, we might say, problematic democracies. And of course, the largest country on earth is also mostly settled by people in the past few hundred years. And as Russians move not west but east, indeed have not Western movies but Easterns, they pushed aside native peoples. They built a transcontinental railroad, the Great Trans-Siberian Railroad. But while there was more freedom for people on the Russian frontier, it can hardly be said that Russia created a vibrant democracy in the 18 or 1900s. And Russia's government today, we might ask some questions about too, if we dared. So there were clearly some problems on various levels of Turner's thesis. But nonetheless, as Turner observed, American history up to the point he was writing in the 1890s was a history of continuous westward expansion. And so his thesis has come back somewhat into favor as long as we recognize its omissions and flaws. But unquestionably the frontier was important. And the frontier did seem to expand ever westward. Of course, in 1805, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific Ocean in the Oregon Country and claimed it for the United States, although American and British fur traders had occasionally visited the region too, laying some claim to the area for their countries, and they expanded their operations. The fur trading post of Astoria in Oregon was founded by John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company in 1811. The area too was claimed by Spain until they gave up their claims to the region in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Russia as well had claims into Oregon, even down into California, most of which they gave up in 1824. The United States and Britain agreed to jointly share the land. In the U.S. through claims made by Lewis and Clark, Robert Gray, the captain of the merchant ship Columbia, and John Jacob Astor, and others. The British had claims dating all the way back to Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe in the mid-1500s. The great explorations of Captain James Cook in the 1760s and 70s, the later explorations of his protege, George Vancouver, a bit later on. And the the claims of the Hudson's Bay Company, which still exists as the oldest company in Canada, and like the various joint stock companies that settled parts of what's now the United States, claimed and settled parts of Canada throughout its history too. Begin in 1818, the U.S. and Britain agreed to jointly share the Oregon country, and both continued to see their people move there. Starting in 1818, American missionaries began to settle the Oregon country, hoping to spread Christianity to the Indians living there. They particularly settled in the fertile Willamette River Valley, in what's now western Oregon State. Other pioneers began to move into the area, particularly in the 1840s, along the famous and dangerous Oregon Trail. By 1846, about 5,000 Americans had moved to the Willamette Valley, and some to other parts of Oregon, again, despite the tremendously deadly character of the Oregon Trail. I've read that it averaged 17 deaths per mile, although I find that a bit implausible. The British, in contrast to America's 5,000 or more residents, could only claim about 700 subjects north of the Columbia River, which, even though we were jointly occupying all of Oregon, was seen by some, particularly the British, as a natural boundary between British North America and the United States. But many Americans felt that with so many of them there, all of Oregon should be ours for the taking, or at least a large part of it. And the British were willing to reach a settlement, proposing to extend the 49th parallel, 49 degrees north latitude, the existing border between the U.S. and Canada, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Although, again, they really want everything north of the Columbia River, but would have settled for the 49th parallel. But some Americans wanted it all. The slogan became 54-40 or fight, referring to the border between Oregon and Russian America, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. And some Americans were willing to seize this, even if it provoked a war with Great Britain. And the concept that America ought to stretch from sea to shining sea was not entirely new. Thomas Jefferson had spoken of an empire of liberty that would spread across North America by natural increase and the weakness of those who held the area west of the United States. People would naturally move in, by which he meant American people. Those who were there would assimilate or vanish. And this notion was increasingly plausible as more and more Americans moved west. In 1845, the Democratic newspaper editor John L. O'Sullivan stated that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. It was obviously our fate, our nature, our duty to overspread North America. And it is a great painting. There we have liberty and enlightenment moving west, pushing aside the forces of darkness, literal darkness, buffalo, bears, Indians, with the way led by pioneers, by settlers in their wagon train, by American scouts on horseback, and following behind her, carriages, railroads, and the telegraph. And there in the distance, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers filled with steamboats, carrying American trade through the continent. But this did potentially lead to conflict with Britain over Oregon. It also threatened to start a war with Mexico, as some Americans, about 1,000 or so, had moved to Mexican California by the 1840s. An even smaller, but still real number, had moved down the Santa Fe Trail into Santa Fe de Nueva Mexico. Furthermore, the Republic of Texas, with many people of American background, had a desire to unite with the United States. At least some Texans and some Americans wanted to see the two countries unite, although there were some Texans who wanted to retain their independent character, and some Americans who questioned the wisdom of absorbing this large area, particularly some Northerners not eager to absorb a large slave state. Furthermore, Mexico had repudiated the Treaties of Velasco, which had recognized the independence of Texas, saying with some accuracy they were forced on Santa Ana at gunpoint. Finally, as I've already hinted at, the annexation of Texas, and indeed expansion into the West in general, would reopen the issue of the expansion of slavery, which was settled forever by the Missouri Compromise, but if we continued to expand, maybe it wouldn't be. Slavery was such a controversial topic that the federal government, at least the House of Representatives, had decided to officially ignore it, creating a Gag Rule in the House of Representatives, where for a period in the mid-1830s and mid-1840s, it was agreed not to discuss slavery whatsoever. But despite the risks of war with Britain, war with Mexico, a renewed conflict over slavery's expansion, manifest destiny, our fate to spread from sea to shining sea became the great issue of the presidential election of 1844.